Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're hiding in plain sight, protected by paperwork, bureaucracy, and a system that's supposed to save children, not lose them. Welcome to today's episode of Unsolved Cases by Skoob, and I'm your host, Larry Hunter. I'm going to tell you about a case that will shake you to your core. It's the story of a little girl named Rilya Wilson, who disappeared from the Florida foster care system for over 15 months before anyone, and I mean anyone, even noticed she was gone. This isn't just a story about one missing child. It's about falsified documents, systematic fraud, brutal abuse, and a child welfare agency so broken that a 4-year-old could vanish into thin air, while the state continued to pretend everything was fine. So settle in, because this case is going to take us through one of the darkest chapters in American child welfare history. Let me introduce you to Rilya Wilson. She was born on September 29, 1996, in Miami, Florida. From the very beginning, Rilya's life was marked by struggle. Her mother was homeless and battling drug addiction, unable to provide even the most basic care. So when Rilya was just a baby, she was taken into the custody of the Florida Department of Children and Families, the DCF. The DCF was supposed to be her safety net, the system designed to protect vulnerable children who couldn't protect themselves. Rilya would never know a normal childhood with her biological family, but at least, or so everyone assumed, the state would keep her safe. When Rilya was about 3 years old, she was placed with a woman named Geraldine Graham and Geraldine's partner, Pamela Graham, in their Miami home. On paper, this seemed like a stable placement. The Grahams would care for Rilya, and DCF caseworkers would visit every single month to make sure she was thriving. But here's where things start to go terribly wrong. Those required monthly visits? They weren't happening. The careful oversight that was supposed to protect Rilya? It didn't exist. And the people responsible for making sure this little girl was safe. They were about to commit one of the most egregious frauds in child welfare history. January 18, 2001. That's the last day anyone claims to have seen 4-year-old Rilya Wilson alive. According to Geraldine Graham's story, and pay close attention to this because it's the story she would stick to for years, an unidentified African-American woman showed up at their home that day. This woman claimed to work for the Florida Department of Children and Families. She said she needed to take Rilya for an evaluation. Just routine, nothing to worry about. And then she left with Rilya and never came back. Think about that for a moment. A child in state custody, supposedly being monitored every month, just disappears with a stranger. And the person caring for her doesn't raise an immediate alarm, doesn't call the police, doesn't storm down to the DCF office demanding answers. Instead, Geraldine claimed she called the child welfare office several times afterward to check on Rilya. She said she was told the girl would be returned. She just kept waiting, and waiting, and waiting. But here's what makes this story fall apart immediately. DCF had absolutely no record of any such visit. No evaluation was scheduled. No worker was assigned to pick up Rilya. There was no paperwork, no documentation, no evidence whatsoever that any DCF employee had been to that house on January 18, 2001. So what really happened that day? That's the question that would haunt investigators for years. Now, let me tell you about the most disturbing part of this entire case. After January 18, 2001, Rilya Wilson was gone. But the Florida Department of Children and Families? They had no idea. For more than a year, 15 months to be exact, the state believed Rilya was safe and sound, living with the Grahams in Miami. How? Because the official record said so. Caseworkers were filing reports claiming they had visited Rilya regularly. These reports stated she was fine, healthy, safe. Month after month, the paperwork flowed through the system saying everything was perfectly normal. Except none of it was true. In court, one former caseworker would later admit the truth. "If you're going to ask me if I went, I already told you I didn't go. She had falsified the reports. She had signed documents saying she'd seen Rilya with her own eyes, when she had never set foot in that home during those crucial months. And she wasn't the only one. Multiple workers had created false records, essentially committing fraud to cover up the fact that they weren't doing their jobs. A review panel would later confirm what everyone suspected. There had been fraud perpetrated here in the official records. Meanwhile, during those 15 months of lies and paperwork, something else was happening. Geraldine and Pamela Graham continued to collect state payments meant for Rilya's care, even though Rilya wasn't there anymore. They cashed those checks month after month, money intended to feed and clothe and house a little girl who had already vanished. And in the spring of 2001, they sold Rilya's bed, her dresser, and her clothes. They got rid of all her belongings, as if she had never existed at all. April 25th, 2002. 15 months after Rilya disappeared. That's when someone finally noticed. A DCF worker went to the Graham home for what should have been a routine visit. She expected to find Rilya there, maybe playing with her younger sister. Instead, she found only the sister. "Where's Rilya?" the worker asked. Geraldine's response was chilling. "I thought you were bringing her." The worker was confused. "What do you mean?" That's when Geraldine repeated her story about the mysterious DCF worker who had taken Rilya over a year ago for an evaluation. She acted as if the state should know exactly where Rilya was, because after all, their employee had taken her. The DCF worker checked the files. No record. She checked with supervisors. No record. She dug deeper into the system. Nothing. No evaluation. No removal. No explanation. Rilya Wilson had been missing from the foster care system for over a year, and this was the first time anyone in authority realized it. Think about the implications of that. A child in state custody, a child the government had a legal obligation to protect, could disappear without anyone noticing for 15 months. The very system designed to save her had lost her in the most catastrophic way possible. As investigators began digging into Rilya's case, they uncovered something even more disturbing than bureaucratic failure. They discovered what life had been like for Rilya before she disappeared. The picture that emerged was one of systematic torture. According to testimony and court records, Rilya wasn't just neglected. She was actively abused in ways that are difficult to even describe. Witnesses, and eventually Pamela Kendrick herself, who would later cooperate with prosecutors, painted a horrifying picture of daily life in that home. Rilya was confined to a small laundry room for extended periods, only allowed out to use the bathroom. She was fed in that cramped space, isolated from the rest of the household. Why? Because the Grahams claimed she was out of control. But it gets worse. Rilya was tied to her bed at night with plastic restraints so she couldn't get up or move around. Imagine being a 4-year-old child, bound to your bed, unable to get water, unable to go to the bathroom, unable to escape if something went wrong. And there were beatings. Rilya was struck with switches as punishment for normal childhood behavior. Perhaps most shocking of all, testimony indicated that Rilya was sometimes kept in a dog cage. A cage meant for an animal was used to confine a little girl. A judge would later summarize it perfectly. Rilya deserved nothing less than a loving and nurturing environment, but instead she lived in fear in a house of torture, fear, and abuse. All of this was happening while DCF records showed regular visits confirming she was safe and well. The system wasn't just failing. It was creating a perfect cover for abuse. When news of Rilya's disappearance broke, it sent shockwaves through Florida and beyond. This wasn't just about one missing child anymore. This was about every child in the system. The governor demanded a full accounting of all children in state care. Where were they? Were they safe? Did anyone actually know? The answer was disturbing. Florida's child welfare system couldn't easily account for every child. The records were unreliable, incomplete, or outright false. At the time Rilya disappeared, Florida was transitioning to a new electronic system called HomeSafeNet, but workers still relied heavily on manual files. There was no centralized, trustworthy database that could tell supervisors whether caseworkers were actually doing their jobs. When officials tried to pull accurate information on children in DCF care after Rilya's case became public, they discovered it was extremely difficult. The agency didn't have the tools, or apparently the will, to ensure accountability. The problems went deeper than just technology. There was a culture of dysfunction. Workers who knew they weren't completing visits simply filed false reports and moved on. Supervisors who should have been checking the accuracy of these reports often never verified anything. One worker was later charged with official misconduct for signing papers that claimed she'd visited Rilya when she hadn't. Communication breakdowns were everywhere. Different parts of the system didn't talk to each other. Law enforcement wasn't informed promptly when children went missing. There was no quick way to alert missing child databases. Critics who had been warning about Florida's overwhelmed child welfare system for years suddenly had the proof they needed. One advocate said that looking into DCF would reveal years and years of dysfunction and incompetence. And Rilya's case proved them right. A blue ribbon panel was formed to examine what went wrong. Their report stressed the need for better oversight, better records, and real accountability. They pointed out something obvious but devastating. A system that depends only on paper files and individual workers' honesty will fail children. With Rilya missing and the system exposed, investigators focused their attention on Geraldine Graham. Background checks that should have been done before Rilya was placed with her revealed a troubling history. Geraldine had served time in a Tennessee prison for food stamp fraud. She'd been on probation in Miami-Dade for writing bad checks. She had a documented diagnosis of mental illness. All of this information existed, but somehow DCF had been unaware of it when they placed a vulnerable child in her care. Police searched the Graham home looking for evidence of what happened to Rilya. They tested the laundry room where she'd been confined. They found traces of blood, but only amounts consistent with normal household use. Nothing that proved Rilya's death had occurred there. Without a body, without physical evidence, the case seemed impossibly difficult to prove. But investigators caught a break from an unexpected source. Jailhouse informants. Geraldine had been arrested on unrelated fraud charges, and while she was behind bars, she apparently couldn't keep quiet about what had really happened to Rilya. An inmate named Robin Lunsford testified that Geraldine confessed to killing the little girl. According to Lunsford, Geraldine described Rilya as evil and said the child was plagued by demons from previous abuse. She claimed that Rilya had pushed her over the edge. Lunsford said Geraldine told her she had smothered Rilya with a pillow and then buried her body near water, in a place she often visited, maybe near a lake or canal. Another inmate, Maggie Carr, testified about conversations with Geraldine regarding the legal challenges of prosecuting a murder case without a body. According to Carr, Geraldine had asked whether the state could charge someone with murder if a body was never found. Then Geraldine allegedly said something chilling. The critters would have taken care of the body. These weren't ideal witnesses. Jailhouse informants are notoriously unreliable and often have their own motives for testifying. But combined with everything else, investigators knew about how Rilya was treated before she disappeared. A picture began to form. In August 2004, more than 3 years after Rilya disappeared, a grand jury indicted Geraldine Graham on multiple serious charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated child abuse. Charging someone with murder when there's no body is extremely rare and difficult to prove. Geraldine's attorney immediately questioned the prosecution's case. This is a woman who they charged with kidnapping without any evidence that she took the child anywhere, and now they've charged her with the murder of a child they have not located. The grand jury disagreed. They said they'd heard the evidence and determined that Rilya's disappearance was the result of violence. They didn't believe the story about a DCF worker taking her. The facts pointed in only one direction. The case would take nearly a decade to go to trial, but in January 2013, Geraldine Graham finally faced a jury. Prosecutors painted a devastating picture. Assistant State Attorney Michael Matters told jurors, she was being brutalized. She was being punished to the extreme. They presented testimony about the dog cage, the restraints, the confinement, the beatings. They brought forward the jailhouse informants who described Geraldine's alleged confessions. Pamela Kendrick, who had once been part of the abuse, testified against her former partner, describing the cruel punishments inflicted on a child who should have been protected. The defense fought back hard. Without a body, they argued, there was no proof Rilya was even dead. Where is the body? Defense attorneys asked repeatedly. They suggested that maybe Rilya was still alive somewhere, lost in the foster care system that had already proven it could lose track of children. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict, but it was split. They convicted Geraldine Graham of kidnapping and multiple counts of aggravated child abuse. The evidence of how Rilya was treated before she disappeared was simply overwhelming. But on the murder charge, the jury deadlocked 11-1. 11 jurors believed Geraldine had killed Rilya. One held out. Without a unanimous verdict, the judge declared a mistrial on that count. Prosecutors could have retried the murder charge, but they chose not to. They had secured convictions on the other charges, and that would be enough. On February 12, 2013, Circuit Judge Marisa Tinkler Mendez sentenced Geraldine Graham to 55 years in prison for the kidnapping and child abuse convictions. Before sentencing, Geraldine addressed the court. Her words rang hollow to many. It's not my intention to make a bad situation worse. Rilya is a very special child to me, and I would never knowingly hurt her in any way. She maintained her innocence, still clinging to the story that someone from DCF had taken Rilya and never returned her. But the jury had already decided that story was a lie. 55 years. Geraldine Graham would likely spend the rest of her life in prison for what she did to a 4-year-old girl who had no one to protect her. But justice for Rilya felt incomplete. Her body has never been found. No one knows exactly where she is or what her final moments were like. There's no grave her family can visit, no place to leave flowers or say goodbye. And the impact extended far beyond one courtroom. Rilya Wilson's disappearance became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when a child welfare system fails at every level. Florida responded with sweeping reforms. The state passed new laws specifically designed to prevent another Rilya Wilson case. It became explicitly illegal for caseworkers to falsify visit reports. Before, workers who lied on paperwork faced potential misconduct charges, but now there were specific statutes targeting this exact behavior. A missing child tracking system was created. When a child in state custody couldn't be located, alerts would go out immediately, not 15 months later. Missing child databases would be notified. Law enforcement would be involved from day one. The state moved toward involving private agencies in supervising foster children, hoping that additional oversight from outside organizations would catch problems before they became catastrophes. Record-keeping systems were improved and standardized. The transition to electronic databases was completed, making it easier to track every child and verify that workers were actually doing their jobs. Supervisors were given more responsibility for confirming that home visits actually occurred, not just reviewing paperwork that claimed they did. These weren't just administrative changes. They were acknowledgments that the system had failed so spectacularly that a child could disappear, and no one noticed for over a year. The case of Rilya Wilson is one of those stories that never really lets go. A 4-year-old girl taken into a system meant to protect her, only to be abused, neglected, and ultimately erased without anyone noticing in time. This wasn't just a crime. It was a collapse at every level. caseworkers who falsified records, supervisors who looked away, and an agency so broken it lost track of a child entirely. Rilya should be in her late 20s today, building a life. Instead, she remains a name tied to unanswered questions and a body that was never found. Her disappearance forced reforms that may have saved others, but those changes came at an unbearable cost. And there are still parts of this case that don't add up, details that continue to haunt investigators and families alike. To uncover the full story, the hidden failures, and the unanswered questions that remain, download the Skoob app now and get access to the complete episode. Because Rilya Wilson was forgotten once, but she shouldn't be forgotten again.